Thank you all for joining us for Power Moves, Shaping New Hampshire's Energy Policy Agenda this morning. We have an exciting and important discussion ahead of us as we explore the strategies, opportunities, and, dare I say, complexities of advancing clean energy initiatives here in New Hampshire. We're going to start by, I'll let each panelist go into as much or as little detail as they'd like with their bio, but I do want to briefly introduce our panel this morning. We're incredibly fortunate to have with us three State House leaders who bring a wealth of knowledge and experience to this conversation. First, sitting next to me from the center of the universe, Epping, Representative Michael Vose. He is the chair of the House Science, Technology, and Energy Committee. Feel free to, they deserve it. Next, Representative Kat McGee, representing the town of Hollis. She is the ranking Democrat on the House Science, Technology, and Energy Committee. And finally, our friend Senator David Waters, who represents District 4. That's Barrington, Dover, Rollinsford, and Somersworth, right? And he is the ranking Democrat on the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. So today, we're certainly going to talk a little bit about this legislative session past, but we're very much looking forward to hearing about what y'all are preparing for come January. I'm sure there are proposals on the horizon that you're excited about, maybe a few that you're less excited about. There's a lot that we don't know, and many of those questions will hopefully be answered on Tuesday, but we do know that folks are working on legislation covering just about the full breadth of clean energy policy. And my friends here on the panel are really the folks who can give us an indication of what might have legs in the new year. Each of you brings a unique perspective and skill set to your work and this program, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity to participate in what promises to be a dynamic and thoughtful discussion. We're going to have each of our panelists, we're going to give each of our panelists some dedicated time, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So start thinking about those, please. I'm going to bring around a handheld microphone, I hope. So please wait for the microphone to ask your question. Let's start with Representative Vose.
So we're starting with biographic information, is that it, Nick?
As much or as little as you'd like. But.
So I've been serving in the New Hampshire House now for 10 years, 5 terms, the last 2 of which I've been honored to be chair of Science, Technology, and Energy. I've had a lifelong fascination with weather and climate, dating back to my service in the United States Air Force, when I spent a year in technical school in Rantoul, Illinois at Chinook Air Force Base, studying weather and climate. That spurred a lifelong interest, and I have been a devotee of reading about climate and weather ever since. In my 10 years in the New Hampshire House, I've worked hard to represent my constituents, to make energy decisions that are beneficial to all of us. And I look forward to hopefully serving another term in the House, but all that depends on what happens next Tuesday.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about your impressions of the session we just had, but tell us, what you're looking forward to working on next year, being mindful that, as we all are, that we're going into a tough budget year, so that's certainly something to think about.
Well, speaking first about the session that just ended, as everybody in this room knows, we had a very evenly divided House this year. And so the accomplishments of the House this year were very bipartisan in nature. And one of the ones that I'm personally most proud of is the reforms that we enacted to the Site Evaluation Committee to make it more efficient, more responsive to the siting of energy projects, and to remove the delays in development of those siting projects that were caused by the structure of the Site Evaluation Committee. It took a lot of work. We made a lot of changes to the SEC. It remains to be seen exactly how effective they will be, but I think, and Senator Waters will speak to this later, I'm sure, as well, I think that the reforms we made will, in fact, improve the siting process significantly. We also put in place some measures to improve some other processes that are very important to the people in this room. For example, we passed legislation to require the Department of Energy to begin a study about how to develop a concrete process for interconnecting projects to the grid. This has been a significant issue over the last several years, and it's time that we had a uniform way to do these interconnection studies so that they can be done promptly and efficiently. So that was a significant accomplishment to get that off the ground. Looking forward to the coming year, I've always had a focus on trying to reduce energy costs ever since I've been in the legislature. And as we all know, among the costs that utilities pay are taxes. They pay property taxes. They pay other kinds of taxes. And one of the cost drivers recently in taxes, actually it's been going back for a decade or more, is the difference between the appraisal values that are set by the Department of Revenue Administration in order to generate the utility property tax versus the appraisals that are done by municipalities to generate property taxes for municipalities. The difference in those two appraisals is often significant, and it leads to litigation where a generation owner will initiate litigation to try to deal with the discrepancy between an appraisal that he gets from the DRA and what he gets from the municipality. When those litigation events happen, costs get added to everybody's electric bill or tax bill or both. And so we need to fix that problem, and that's a legislative initiative that I will be working on this year. And I think Senator Waters will join me on that. Something else that I think we all are excited about and have been anticipating for years is the potential of small modular nuclear reactors. You all know probably that Amazon, Google, and Microsoft have all recently signed contracts to acquire nuclear power to drive their AI data centers. And in the case of Google and Amazon, they've signed contracts with startups who want to build small nuclear reactors. Well, I think that those developments will give momentum to an industry that we've been talking about for a long time. And we'll finally start to see some small modular nuclear reactors, let's call them SMRs for short. We'll finally start to see some action on the SMR front. And so I think legislation in New Hampshire that hangs a sign on the door that says New Hampshire is open for SMR activity will be another legislative initiative that I hope we can gather some momentum for this year. In addition to that, we might want to think outside the box and see if there's other things that we could do to spur innovation here in New Hampshire. Obviously, we have great innovation going on with the Community Power Coalition of New Hampshire, even today, but are there other things that we could do to spur innovation? There's a movement in Texas right now for something called consumer regulated energy. And it is essentially a simple concept that says if someone wants to generate electricity and sell it to someone else, should they be allowed to do that without being regulated? The only regulation they would be subject to would be market regulation, keeping their customers happy. That could be something that we could think about. CRE, as it's called, consumer regulated energy, only works if these energy projects are not, I repeat, not connected to the grid. So for example, someone might build a power plant right next to a large consumer of electricity and sell all that energy to that consumer. And they would have to provide their own connection from the plant to the consumer. That opens the door for all kinds of innovations in the energy market. And it's a relatively simple thing to enable it here in New Hampshire. So I'm going to be looking at submitting legislation potentially here to enable consumer regulated energy. There's other things we can talk about, but I don't want to hog the time here. I'm sure my colleagues have other things they want to talk about as well. So I'll look forward to answering your questions later and maybe talking about other things later as well.
Yeah, fantastic, thank you. Representative McGee.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you to all of you for being here. It's welcome this morning, and it's nice to see so many familiar faces. My name is Kat McGee, and I've been in the legislature for 3 terms. I've served all of it on the House Science, Technology, and Energy Committee, and I hope to be returning for a 4th term after the election on Tuesday. My interest in regional energy started when there was a Kinder Morgan pipeline project that was scheduled to go through northern Mass with a spur that bifurcated my town in southern New Hampshire. So the original plan had a 50-foot easement that was going from the southwest corner to the northeast corner, going over conservation land. And I was running at the time for state office, and I attended a meeting of the current state reps just to sort of see how they managed those community interactions. And everybody that showed up at that meeting had received a letter saying that their land was involved in the plan and would be affected. So these folks were upset, and what I realized is many of these folks were noticeably upset because they realized that they had no power to push back against any encroachment on their property. The folks that owned the conservation land also hired an attorney and an engineer immediately. But what was interesting to me was that our local government understood this was a federal project because it crossed state lines, and so they were like, we don't have anything to do with this. And so because of my project and program management background, I spoke with the selectmen in my town, and they ended up doing what all local officials do when they're faced with something like this. They said, you came forward, so you can manage the task force. So I chaired this local task force in order to figure out if there were state protections that could be reasonably brought forward to protect the town from that project. And it pulled me into a world of environmental activism and state law. And so that's sort of my first intersection with understanding that we were on a regional grid and that it was relatively complicated. I wanted to answer the questions of, do we need the gas? And ultimately, that project failed, not because there were activists shaking their hands and holding signs, but because they really couldn't sell the gas. But I realized that the decisions that we're going to be making at this juncture in our energy transition would be costly and extremely impactful to future generations. And that is why, when I decided that this is where the table that I wanted to sit at was to try and help government make better decisions around how we move forward so that we have practical solutions. Chairman Vose and I have many conversations from our differing perspectives on this. I always say it's a math problem, and he says it's a money problem. And I think they're not distinct from each other in that one affects the other. If we take no action, we'll end up paying more in the long run. And so that balance between the short-term thinking and planning and the long-term thinking and planning is really where I think state legislatures can play a major role. And I think in the years that I've served in the legislature, in my first term, we had a significant majority in the House and the Senate, but we had 57 vetoes. We had 12 energy bills vetoed, and that was kind of unheard of. I mean, sort of the entire legislative agenda was thwarted. At that time, we were trying to pass full net metering up to 5 megawatts. Many of you in this room will be familiar with the fact that that's been an ongoing back and forth in terms of a priority. Many of us were ready to make that leap and understood that if you enable the market, then people are going to invest where it makes sense, and we're going to be lowering our demand for outside fuels. So we thought that was sort of a no-brainer. And the veto messages basically indicated that there was a concern for cost shifting to people who did not have the money to invest in those types of projects, and they didn't want to see any money going anywhere that it shouldn't go. So that exception by the governor maintained for all the vetoes against raising the net metering cap above 1 megawatt over the last several years. And we waited for 5 years, from 2017 until 2022, to finally receive the value of distributed energy report that examined whether or not there was cost shifting that we should be concerned about in enabling people to generate energy where they wanted to and put it on the grid for others to use and be actually benefiting from the value that they're generating. And that report concluded that the cost shifting was negligible. It was not really a factor in the decision making. So we're still at the point where we're trying to confer with each other about what we believe and what we know versus what we know, and come up with policies that make sense for the state of New Hampshire so that we can continue to give people what they need to remain competitive in the 21st century, what the state needs in order to have an actual plan. I think the keynote speaker said it well. There's a lack of vision in terms of what are we doing, why are we doing it, how does it help people? And I think that's what we'll talk about more in this panel, but that's sort of where we're at. We're on the cusp of that for this session. So I think it's going to be an exciting session for us to be putting some sort of puzzle pieces together for New Hampshire to get on track with having plans around lowering emission and also capacity planning to make sure that we are resilient and secure. So I didn't say a lot about myself except that I sort of jumped into the fray. I was looking for something to do. I stopped working right before I started running for office. I was at Skillsoft at the time as a program manager for international software teams. And before that, I was an enterprise-wide project manager at John Hancock Financial in Boston. So I'm a person who likes to see a plan, and I think that's where we start looking into the next legislature in 2025. That's it.
Thank you.
Yep.
As we know, the approach in the Senate can often be significantly different from the House, sometimes not, but certainly interested in your perspective, Senator Waters, about what the people in this room need to be on the lookout for going into next year.
Well, thanks so much, and kudos to my colleagues, Representative Vose and McGee. What a good team we've had the last few years and getting a lot of good things done. So biographical, I was an English professor for 39 years, which prepared me beautifully for over the last 16 years in the legislature to do energy and environment and transportation policies. So watch out for English professors. My grandmother's prayer began, look forward, not back, and so that's what I'm going to do. We had the successful auctions for 6.8 gigawatts of offshore wind power on Tuesday. Avangrid and Invenergy, I guess they pronounce it. And so that process now begins. That's about five plus Seabrooks in terms of power. 2.3 million homes it can power. It raises a lot of issues. Transmission, of course, workforce, storage issues. Let me please mention that we have a relatively new director of the Office of Offshore Wind and Other Energy Projects. And Tom, if you wouldn't mind standing up. You know, Tom Barrasso. We have a tip-top energy expert in that office, and he's going to do great things for us. I think that offshore wind is going to reopen the question about procurement for New Hampshire. I think particularly because of the bill that is on the cusp of passing in Massachusetts, which will include Seabrook in their renewable energy requirements, so it's possible that Massachusetts could secure long-term contracts for most of the power out of Seabrook, which means New Hampshire would have to be going into other markets, which the default would be natural gas, which could subject us to price spikes. So that we don't find ourselves in that situation of not having adequate diversification of resources, I think we do need to look at perhaps procurement again there. Net metering is going to be a top issue again, as Kat was saying, that I think we have to be all in on solar this year, all in on solar. We have less than 1% in the state. They're 20 to 27% in the states around us, and that does a lot for their consumers, particularly the industrial host bill. I think that's going to come back, and I think we'll pass it this time. I think we also need to look at the demand charge alternatives. This is something that Clean Energy New Hampshire is interested in, and I think that will be a good reform for industry and other folks. I do think we need to look at a host of PUC issues, kind of most immediately to assure the PUC that the legislature meant what it said and said what it meant. And thank you, Representative Vose, for the work on that a few years back on the New Hampshire Saves energy efficiency programs. We have to make sure that the PUC understands what we did, and they will do what they're supposed to do. But there are other matters that have been raised by the consumer advocate. I do think we need to have the consumer advocate's office involved in the projects that it's now excluded from, and I think that we also may need to include the asset infrastructure, asset condition projects under the purview of the SEC. I think then I think there's going to be some effort on electric vehicle infrastructure. I think we'll see another make-ready bill. We also have some slight tweaks that we need to do. The Municipal Association wants particularly an option in the registration fee for EV charging projects. Also, we need something to do about a parking fine for people who park where they are. I thought I'd done that in my original bill on parking, but I guess not. I think also we're going to have some legislation on storage. This will be connected not only to offshore wind. These are large battery storage projects. The new technologies are fabulous. We know about the project that's being proposed by Granite Power, and I think we may need to look at our regulatory framework to make sure that New Hampshire is a place that's open for business on that. Transmission. I think that's just, if we're going to increase our energy needs by 50 to 100% over the next decades, we better make sure we have the transmission. We've already heard a lot about that today, interconnection, you name it. I'd like to end kind of on the big picture. Imagine New Hampshire that wanted to work in the region with other governors on energy, job creation, transmission, renewables to take advantage of the new energy economy. Imagine that New Hampshire wasn't the donut hole, but was actually a partner to reach out and accept the hands that have been extended to us by the governors in the states around us. Imagine a New Hampshire in which an acknowledgement of climate change and the economic job opportunities around it, as well as issues of public health, if that were the context for policy, so that we would look to join our other states with a greenhouse gas reduction target by 2050 or 2060. But as I imagine these things, I remember, one of my favorite childhood books was John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, which ends with, "And I awoke and it was all a dream." Thank you.
Thank you very much. So now we have some time for questions from the audience. It can be about what you've heard or something you came here to hear today that you haven't heard. All good faith discourse is welcome. Gabe has the mic. So can we start over here with our consumer advocate, Don Kreese?
Hi, everybody. Good morning, honorable legislators. I have a question for my friend Representative Vose. I learned something from him. I'd never heard the phrase consumer regulated electricity before you just said it. I Googled it, and the first thing I got to was an article by the Cato Institute, which is a libertarian think tank. And the example of consumer regulated electricity they gave is the plan that I think Amazon has to partner with the owner of the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant in Pennsylvania so that Amazon can power a big data center in Pennsylvania by drawing power from 3 Mile Island. That's a pretty cool idea, I think. But since my job is to advocate on behalf of residential customers, I'm trying to think about how that might work at the residential level. And I know that my friends up in Maine are studying the idea of a distribution system operator that would open up the electricity grid at distribution voltage to regular people like us buying and selling at distribution level. Do you think that idea has any potential, and does it resonate with what you're talking about when you're talking about this idea of consumer regulated electricity?
Thank you for that question, Don. Actually, what I mentioned was consumer regulated energy. It's not just electricity. And it is an innovation that's being looked at right now in Texas. And the idea behind it is if we can get the regulators out of the way, we can open the door to innovation. Can we predict what that innovation will be? No, because by definition, innovation is new ideas. And so in my view, and in the legislation that I potentially will introduce, consumer regulated energy will simply get the regulators out of the way to let bottom-up innovation percolate and create maybe new ideas that we've never even thought of before.
Sounds cool.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. David Kuhnhart from the Tamworth Energy Committee. This is a question about raising our vision, raising our sights. Of all of the states in the entire Northeast, including New York and Pennsylvania, and also including Canada, New Hampshire has the distinction of having the lowest, by far, renewable portfolio standard. When states push up their renewable portfolio standard, it becomes a new goal to set. It becomes an opportunity for innovation. It becomes an opportunity for job creation. Is there any chance that the new legislature in 2025 will raise the New Hampshire renewable portfolio standard above the basement where it currently resides?
I know this is an area of particular interest for you, Representative McGee. If you want to take this, feel free to jump in, guys. But.
It is. Thank you. Thank you for the question, too. I know Tamworth does some really good work. The answer is yes. The Renewable Portfolio Standard statute that's on the books now only covers us through 2025, and the original goal, which was modest, to say the least, was 25% by 2025. So it was a goal we felt we could get to, and our renewables in the state don't just consist of the solar that we've adopted, which has been very minimal, but also it includes the hydro, small hydro, and also our biomass, which was, when I first started paying attention to the portfolio pie that the Office of Energy Planning used to put out regularly to show us sort of where we were attempting to make emissions strides, that sector of the pie for biomass was about 8%. Many of those plants are no longer functioning to contribute like they did in the past. So I'm not sure what that new portfolio pie looks like. We don't really have, well, I mean, we have the EIA data, but it's not the same as it was when I first started paying attention in terms of us being really clear about what we have for renewables in the state. But to your question about updating the renewable portfolio standards, I do think that this is the appropriate time for us to undertake that. Whether it will be the first year or the second year, I'm not sure if we can get to it in the first year, but what it does is it gives us a marker to work towards, and it should be for the next 10 years. So it should be 2025 to 2035. Where do we expect to be at the end of that decade? And then we can actually start working on plans by sector to get us there.
I would just add to Representative McGee's comments that any examination of the RPS and where it goes beyond 2025 should also ask some serious questions about, is the RPS accomplishing the goals that we set out to accomplish? Is the RPS giving us what we want? Is the RPS hampering what we want to do in the future? So we need to not look just at, well, what percentages are we going to raise, et cetera. We need to ask and analyze whether or not the RPS is doing what we want it to do, is achieving the goals that we want to achieve.
Great. Who's next?
No.
Jeff Moulton from the Dairy Net Zero Task Force. We've heard a lot about transmission, but there's also a big bottleneck coming up in the local distribution side for electricity. And other utilities around the country have introduced time of use rates, basically using smart meters. Do you see any initiatives maybe next year looking at that?
Well, I'll mention on that there has been some action in the past. It does seem that the performance-based rate making might be a vehicle whereby there be more adoption of the smart meters. It has been difficult to get the utilities, because of the costs involved, to move forward on that. So I think at this point it may be something that's more driven by the cases that are brought forward and whether PBR is used.
I can also.
By all means.
Last session, I had a bill on having our major utility who has older infrastructure to provide access to smarter meters for people who wanted to invest in them. So it wasn't a mandate, which would mean that everybody would have to pay for that investment across the board. It was just allowing early adoption, and it still didn't go anywhere. But I take your point that we have to walk before we can run, and we're not currently able to use, to benefit from time of use rates or move forward on infrastructure investments that people can really lower their costs with, without leveraging technology to do that. And it goes back to us not having an overall plan that we're following. So where these pieces fit into our overall strategy, I think, you know, to Chairman Vose's point about are we sure that the RPS is fulfilling what we put it in place to do? At this point, we're not aligned on the questions that we're trying to answer with the policies that we're putting in. You know, the RPS serves a piece of a puzzle for a state that is in earnest following a plan to lower emissions. But if we're not aligned on whether that is one of our goals that we're trying to achieve, then it becomes less significant. So I think we do need to have stronger planning in order to prepare the state for the future as far as energy goes. The hard part with climate science and also with energy is you don't see it. And so it's very easy to lose a lot of time taking for granted the systems that we have. On the Democratic side of the Science, Technology, and Energy Committee, we've been meeting over the off months to come up with buckets of bills that we think are gaps in the energy policy in the state of New Hampshire. And certainly distributed system operation is one of the categories that we've surfaced as a way to decouple the management of distributed energy resources getting onto the system and being leveraged quickly, right? So if you want to take regulation out of the way, you could take the monopoly out of the way and say that the distributed system operator would be distinct from having the utilities be the police for how people get on and off the system. So that's sort of an example of one of the things we're talking about. We're also robustly pursuing the conversation around performance-based rate making again, which Senator Waters, you know, initiated in the last session, because it, you know, to the keynote speaker's point, the utilities are integral in how rapidly we can transition away from a dirtier system. And so they have to be incentivized to be partners in that process rather than simply being incentivized for business as usual. So, so that's performance-based rate making. I think it was a big topic of conversation in the last 2 years, and I think it will be again. And you know, it sometimes takes us a while to get things through, but hopefully we'll have the ability to do that. So, did you want to add?
Well, the only thing I'll add to that is that we do have the Department of Energy formulating the Energy Action Plan, which is going to focus a lot on efficiencies. And one way to get efficiencies is through the real-time metering. I would note too, we just heard in the keynote about the DLR, and I think that's another way of thinking about dynamic line rating. As it's slightly different from this conversation, but it certainly is another method for introducing efficiencies into the transmission side.
All right, next question.
According to the American Council on Energy Efficiency, New Hampshire ranks 27th, which we have the lowest or worst score in the Northeast United States. Our energy code goes to 2018. How do you feel about changes and modifications in our building and energy codes? Our current building code is 2021.
No, it isn't.
Well,
2018, right?
I'll speak to that. We did do the bill to update the energy code we're using, and one particular issue in that was the kind of efficiency rates in construction. And I know that Senator Shaheen had acquired about $20 million that could have come to us if we'd gone to the most recent standards, but we did not get there on that. And so, I mean, it's complicated because of the home builders and escalating costs of construction in this state, which are really tough, and the shortage of housing that we have. So I think you can see why the legislature was a little anxious about going to the most recent energy standards. We've always been one behind. That's what we do. But it seemed to me the low-hanging fruit in terms of our efficiencies was to accept the proposal that we did have on the Senate floor to go to the more contemporary, the newest standards on that, and we didn't get there, and so we lost that federal money that was available to us. But it seems to me that as we try to solve our housing supply crisis, that there really should be leverage in that to make sure that we are providing more energy efficiency. We also certainly have ways through New Hampshire Saves to perhaps increase the cap that we have put on of how much can be in that account. I think with community solar, I mean, just there's so many projects that our community action partners are doing that there's no shortage of homes. Look at Maine that had a goal of 100,000 heat pumps in low-income homes, and they blew through that. Now they're going for 150,000. Well, that was a wise investment of their era money, and I guess we spent ours on other things. But you know, there's a lot that's there. There's a lot of low-hanging fruit. But as I said in my dream, we can only imagine a state in which it wanted to participate in these projects with our neighboring states and use the tools that we already have to reach some of these goals.
I can just add, while you're getting to your next person, I would just add that there is going to be a bill, I believe it's Representative Thomas, not Doug, but Wendy, on our committee. And I was planning to co-sponsor that bill to increase the building codes standards to the 2021 standards again this year. You know, we've lost the last 2 years. We understand that there are concerns around costs. There are always concerns around costs, but sometimes the longer we delay, you know, there's a diminishing returns in holding that off, in that we do not qualify for federal funding that can help us with increased energy efficiency. And the gains that you make through energy efficiency, I know our consumer advocate always says the negawatt is the least expensive form of energy. The energy that you save has value, and so we have to have more sophisticated conversations in the legislature about what we're trying to achieve and what those gains actually are, instead of simply saying, if it costs money, we can't do it, because that limits how competitive we remain in the region. And I don't like being referred to as the donut hole. And I also have heard that one of the problems that we have in trying to go faster at this point with all of the federal dollars that are actually being allocated to our state for advanced heat pump technology and for just renewable investments in general. We have that money. We also have the tranche for RGGI, which in 2023 we received $57 million, but we're not using that money. It's going back to ratepayers on their bills, as many of you know, and that's because of, you know, legislative authority. So we're not making these investments, and we could be more efficient in using that funding if we actually had goals we were trying to achieve. So that seems to be the missing piece, and we're trying to look at gaps that we can easily fill this year, and hopefully that will help us get back on track for, and we also should mention that the Department of Environmental Services was charged with pulling together a comprehensive climate action plan, which at this point is disjointed from our energy planning, but they are required to do it in order to secure additional federal funding under the IRA. And so they are coming up with, they've hired experts, and they are coming up with a plan by sector for what New Hampshire will be pursuing. And so hopefully at some point we can connect our energy planning to that climate planning.
And I would just briefly add that as someone who sat through all of those executive departments and administration hearings, I think it was frankly very difficult to have a good faith conversation around codes this past session. There was a lot of misinformation being thrown around. very irresponsibly. So if that is an issue that you care about, that you would like to drive forward, we are going to need more voices to show up at the State House.
Thank you, Dan Weeks, Revision Energy. Thank you very much for all of your service in Concord. A couple of you brought up net metering as a recurring issue in Concord. When it has been brought up, the focus has typically been on the cap, the size of projects that can participate in net metering, which is still 1 megawatt in most cases. And I appreciate Senator Waters mentioning the industrial host bill, which would expand those who can participate beyond 1 megawatt. But I wonder if you could comment just for a moment on the value of the kilowatt hours, in addition to the question of size, and to be a little bit more concrete here, for a New Hampshire family that maybe rents, doesn't own their home, or their roof is too shaded, but they want to participate in the energy transition, if they want to be part of a community solar project, the value per kilowatt hour that they would get from being a participant in an offsite project is a little better than half of what they pay for a kilowatt hour on their bill. And in other states, it's typically 1-to-1. And that value that they get today, around 11 cents, is also a little better than half of the empirical value of that energy on the grid, according to the value of distributed energy resources, the VEDR study that Representative McGee mentioned. So I just wonder if there's any thinking, not just about the cap, the size of projects that can participate in net metering, but also the value of those kilowatt hours, and whether that might be brought up to avoid what we see as a kind of reverse cost shift, if it might be brought up to the VEDR rate, the empirical value that the state has found in the last year or two.
Well, I would say I think that there's opportunity in community solar, for sure. We did do the slight change, I don't know, last year, year before, that would mean it'd be possible to get the lists of folks who could be aggregated, and I'd be curious to see whether that in itself has helped out. I've kind of really wondered about this, though, is that if it were possible for a group like, say, Community Power Coalition of New Hampshire, or municipalities or others, to actually be the developers of solar projects that could be directed towards those community power folks, whether that might be a way of accelerating the ability to supply the power to them, and have communities that are wanting to do such things to be able to do that. I do think that the overall picture, though, is that if we can raise the net metering cap, that will incentivize investments in all kinds of ways.
I serve as,
Go ahead, yeah,
I didn't mean to interrupt.
I'd like to know.
I serve as the chair of the planning board in my town of Epping, and we see a lot of site plans for developments. Sometimes they're small, 5, 6, 10 houses. Sometimes they're huge. Like we have one development that was built recently that had 100 houses in it. And I've often wondered why we're not seeing innovation in these developments. Why aren't developers putting together in their plans to build these developments a community solar project or a community geothermal heating project? I would think if these kinds of projects were integrated together, they would make for great development projects that would make houses sell like hotcakes. And we don't see that happening. And I'm not sure why that's not happening, what we could do to incentivize builders to think about doing those kinds of projects. But it's a conversation I think at some point we're going to have. So the next time there's a building code bill that comes before the House, maybe we need to start asking those kinds of questions, see if we can get answers.
I think that's a great point and a great sort of segue. To your question about rates, I think one of the challenges for the legislature, where we are well-intentioned but we are not necessarily experts, is we rely on those reports that come out to tell us maybe where we should be in terms of price signals for the market, but I myself first want to do no harm. And so we really do need more knowledge in order to do anything to interfere with that. Rate setting is done by the Public Utilities Commission, and that regulatory body has that slice of the pie, if you will. In terms of innovation, I think we've heard even from not just developers but also plant owners about the risk that people are assuming when they invest in renewable plants, not knowing how quickly they will receive a return on investment. You know, trying to pencil it out is the way we generally refer to it. And also, if the state is in any way capricious about how we view markets and the value of energy that's coming from different sources, if we don't get that piece right, then it makes it more volatile and people will not invest in innovation. So the state has a lot to do with setting the framework so that people feel like investing here. And I think that's another piece where, for example, I've spoken with Taylor Caswell, who's in charge of business and economic development for the state of New Hampshire, about the idea of an infrastructure bank. And he said, you know, that's what we need. We need short dollars available for people who want to make investments that are larger than will just happen on their own. And so that concept for an LSR, coming back to an infrastructure bank that would be devoted to helping people get over that hump and find those short dollars at low interest rates, that's how you incentivize innovation. And it doesn't happen on its own because it's expensive to get over that hump. So I would say, you know, those are the types of missing pieces that the legislature can help with. And there is a significant amount of funding coming to the state, and the question is really, how does it best get used in order to serve the needs of the people of the state? What do people want to do? Where do they want investments? Where do we need investments? I also am planning to try and put in some legislation around having the Department of Energy pursue additional information than they currently provide to us every 3 years by statute on the 10-year energy strategy plan. That plan is supposed to tell us where we're going, what we're doing to lower emissions by sector. And right now, there's no aspect of that plan that addresses capacity planning or looks at changes to the grid and where they're needed and what it's going to cost and that sort of thing. I think that those types of insights should be available to legislators because the transmission piece and the distributed piece need more thought and need more answers if you actually want the market to succeed.
Hello. I have a question for you all. But first, I'm going to make a statement, which seems to be the way we're doing it. I believe in positive reinforcement. So I think that one thing that the state of New Hampshire is doing incredibly well is community power. When we launched Nashua Community Power in 2023, I think the cost of electricity was 22 cents a kilowatt hour, and we've driven the rate down to 8.1 cents a kilowatt hour at its lowest, and now the lowest rate for Nashua is 8.6 cents a kilowatt hour. And that's amazing that we were able to do that through the state legislative process. So my question for all of you is, how will we continue to use community power, and how will you weave that into legislation that you're working on so that we can continue to strengthen these programs, decrease rates, and have innovation in the state?
Good question.
Well, I'll start. Epping joined the Community Power Coalition this year, and on October 1st of this year, Epping went live with community power. So people are starting to get their November bills this month, and they'll see their prices come down for the electricity they buy. So the question, I think, is what can the legislature do to help community power succeed? And I think the answer to that question is simply to remove regulatory barriers that prevent future innovations that community power coalition members want to see happen. So that would be the short answer to the question. The long answer, of course, is, well, what specific barriers are there? I don't know that we have time to go into all of that today. I'm not sure we know what all the barriers are, but that conversation, I guarantee you, will happen in the legislature this year and in future years. Community power is obviously a significant force going forward in the energy future of New Hampshire.
Okay. Well, I think there is the biggest issue that came to us in the legislature this year that I think we're going to be trying to figure out how to address is that Community Power Coalition customers who are participating in net metering are not currently able to realize that net metering, someone clapping, that net metering value as a community power customer. And and this happens, when you integrate something new into a system, there's going to be some settling and there's going to be some pieces that don't mesh right out of the gate. And so there will be legislation filed this time around to try and assist with that aspect of their business. From what I have seen, and my town, Hollis, is also on the road to adopting community power. The innovation is not a problem for community power, right? They sort of exist in order to help provide that innovation that was lacking in New Hampshire. And so they are going to help New Hampshire push that envelope just by their very business model and their leadership and their vision that they're supplying. So we are lucky, I think, to have had that stood up in our state to help supply some competition that was lacking. And I think the legislature, having stood up community power, should then look again at the price signals and the market and how we're allowing them to operate as a competitor so that we give them the ability to bring the innovation that will help us drive costs down.
Bill has a question.
Hi. Well, I think we all admire the difficulty of your job, and I think everyone has expressed today the challenges that you face. They're pretty enormous. And the rate of change is also staggering. And I know that the resources that you have to draw on are, minimal, and we're all volunteers. So wouldn't it be wise to maybe invest in a third party to come in and help you develop a vision for the next, describe the most economical and viable pathways into the future, define the obstacles in an unbiased way, and there are large corporations that specialize in doing this. McKinsey comes to mind. Seems like a really good investment for the state. It's something that large corporations do. It's something our municipalities do. Why doesn't the state do this?
Well, I'll respond to that briefly because I will say that because of the federal funding that came in for the Energy Action Plan, that I think the Department of Energy is going to do a very good job on that, and that will fill one of the gaps here. I don't think it'll include some of the kind of vision planning about sources and so on that maybe some of us would like, but I think that's good as well. And Kat mentioned the DES planning. I'm not sure, Bill, that we have a need for someone outside of government. I think what we do need, though, is an impetus from inside government whether through legislation or through a governor who cares about these things, to coordinate the extraordinary resources that we have in our state agencies. We have great people and capable of doing great work, but I do think that there, the states around us that have an office, a state office of energy, or various different names. I mean, we have a Department of Energy, but we don't have somebody who focuses on climate action, say, or renewable energy, say, in terms of, if you look at the states around us, they've done these kind of all government approaches to these issues, and we don't have that kind of entity in the governor's office. So I think there are ways to get where you think we ought to get by using our resources. I just think it takes some, whether it's legislative action or executive action, I think that's what we need most.
I would just say, my understanding is that both DES and DOE have gone outside to hire the expertise, to hire the expertise that they need. It's not unusual for them to do that. It still comes down to what are people being directed to focus on in their work, and whether or not we can get to a plan that we then find we are also executing on, right? So I think this next 2 years should be taking us from sort of excuses for not doing things to figuring out how to put the pieces in place to execute on some of the things that really make sense. And we have spent a lot of time discussing what makes sense and what doesn't make sense in terms of energy policy in the state. What seems to be lacking is the connection to what Senator Waters was saying, the connection between whether we're doing it in terms of a transition to lower emissions, whether there's actually an impetus for the investments that we're making in the transition. We've kind of lost that piece, and that thread is really essential to why all the states around us are embroiled in the transition policies that they are. So we can still be in a position where we're trying to decide which ones are right for us, whether it's going to look at nuclear power to say if we're going to have to increase capacity, we're going to need more than just the renewables we can bring online quickly in the next 20, 30, 40 years. But it's not about that end game, but it's about the planning. It's about us getting on the same page that we're planning toward an end that we agree on, and we don't even have that yet.
And remember, government is always 2, 3, 4, 5 years behind what real people are doing in our economy. So I think that...
But it doesn't have to be.
Well, I think it does have to be, because that's where real change comes from. When real people are willing to invest their own money and risk their own money, that's how change happens. It doesn't come from the top down.
We have, before we go too far down that rabbit hole,
we're capable. We're getting all geared up to go down a rabbit hole together, weren't we?
You're doing great, Mike.
It's good you stopped us.
we have a couple minutes before lunch, so if I could be indulgent and ask a question to really sort of bring this back to local solutions and things we can do at the state level. We talked about some technologies that are very exciting but might be more on the horizon. We've talked about some technologies that are largely being built and supported close by, but maybe not in New Hampshire or off New Hampshire. But we know that we need more electrons, and we know a lot of them are going to need to be homegrown electrons, right? And what we also know is that what is being built in New Hampshire is local solar and batteries. We know that that's what's filling up the interconnection queue. So we've talked a lot about net metering, but there are a great many issues that would be included in the net metering docket or be adjacent to it. But I'm wondering if you could just speak to, in the simplest terms possible, how do we unlock the full potential of community solar in New Hampshire, and what are the impediments to that?
Senator Waters, I know this is a subject about which that is very close to your heart, so Give us some wisdom.
Well, I think my wisdom is probably going to be what folks like Clean Energy New Hampshire tells me is wise to do. He says facetiously, you know, we have filing period coming up, and we have the election coming up, and that's going to condition what we can do. To me, I think, you know, you've mentioned some of the components there, that we have a real problem with interconnection, and I mean, aside from the net metering issues that could drive the innovation, we have a problem with interconnection. We've got a problem of how do we integrate storage into all these projects. So I think, to me, that's the big one. If we can find a way to really incentivize storage, and you know, perhaps even having some kind of cost recovery around that, I think we'd be able to make the numbers work a whole lot better for community solar. And you know, I also, just for my way of thinking, is I would like to think that all community solar we do has the low-income solar as a component. To me, that is kind of meaningful. Is, you know, what the government? Why do we need government? Well, it's the public good. That's why we need the government. And I think that the way we've seen cost escalation, and we've seen the poverty rates in this state, and the housing costs, which are driving more and more people away from their workplaces and out of the realm of possibility of getting housing, that, you know, the energy picture of that, I think, is something that we can use as a kind of a social policy. And a community solar would be a kind of umbrella that might embrace a lot of projects. So I don't, you know, as I said, I don't have a lot of, you know, I have some vision there, but I think in terms of how we actually do it is going to depend on the people who are actually doing it. I hear from my municipalities in my district. I hear, you know, national, whatever other folks are doing. We always hear a lot from Cliff Below, don't we? You know, and it's good, because who else is going to, you know, tell us what they're facing, what the issues are for them as they're trying to get the projects financed and getting them built.
Yeah, and we look forward to continuing those conversations. I would be remiss to not say that I tremendously enjoy working with all three of you, and we appreciate how open you are to spending time with us and on these issues, and thank you for being here today.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.